So on to chapter 14 through 18 of the Second Treatise of Government by John Locke. This will probably be the second to the last discussion of Locke's second treatise that I'll do. In this one, I've titled it Questioning Sacred Authority, because towards the end of this particular segment, Locke discusses the necessity to at least potentially depose a king, even though his person has been considered sacred and inviolable by tradition. But before we get to that, Locke speaks of executive prerogative, and this is the concept that the executive, typically the king in his mind, does what is necessary when the legislature is not in session. And Locke concedes that this power that the executive has to do what is necessary, especially to respond to the needs of the moment, it's necessary because he says the law cannot anticipate all these needs, and the legislature can't always be meeting. In fact, elsewhere he said that having a legislature that is always constantly in session is probably a recipe for problems, that tyranny can come from the legislative branch as well, and that would be a good way to get it. He also says that the executive can and sometimes is given a lot of latitude and discretion to use power for a long time, and so this happens because the executive uses that prerogative well and doesn't abuse it. But he says even though an executive may have had that prerogative for a long time without it being questioned, that doesn't mean that it is his truly. Instead, it's the people's, and so no king should be able to argue that his people have encroached on his prerogative by wanting to take back some part of it, or, meeting in a legislative session, passing a law. He can't say that they've taken back something that isn't rightfully theirs, because, as you recall, all power comes from the people through the legislature, because they're the closest to the people. They pass the laws. The king or president or other executive office is there to carry those laws out. If the king uses his discretion or prerogative, in the meantime, it is at the behest of the legislature and at the pleasure of the legislature. So Locke asks the question, who will judge when the power is used rightly? And I think a couple of weeks ago I mentioned the judicial power, and I hope I didn't do that in a way that would lead people to think of it as it exists in, say, the United States today, as sort of a separate and fairly powerful branch of government. We'll notice that here, when he asks who will judge when the power of the executive is used rightly, he doesn't answer a court, certainly no Supreme Court. In Locke's view, the courts, of course, are necessary, but they are in no way even equal to the executive power, let alone the legislature. The courts are there to settle issues, not to make the laws or even to evaluate them against any sort of constitution. So in Locke's system, there's no judicial branch in that sense of completely separate and providing a checks and balances on the other branches of government. Okay, it's just the function of judging based upon the laws that are given. So anyway, in answer to that question, who will judge when the power is used rightly, Locke says, I answer, between an executive power in being with such a prerogative and a legislative that depends upon his will for their convening, there can be no judge on earth, as there can be none between the legislative and the people. Should either the executive or the legislative, when they have got the power in their hands, design or go about to enslave or destroy them, the people have no other remedy in this, as in all other cases where they have no judge on earth, but appeal to heaven. I wanted to emphasize this section here because notice he says there can be no judge on earth to decide, if the executive power has used its prerogative rightly. It's a question to be answered between the executive and the legislative power, and there's no power in between them. There's no judge on earth. And then towards the end, he says, more or less, because they have no judge on earth, they must appeal to heaven. And so people reading this ask themselves, what does he mean, appeal to heaven? And truly, it may be confusing. It sounds almost like he's saying, well, if there's no other way to settle this, let's all pray. That's not what he's talking about. That phrase, the appeal to heaven, is used in several spots in this book. It's important, and it means something very specific. He uses it again on the next page, and he gives us a clue when he says, God and nature never allowing a man so to abandon himself as to neglect his own preservation. And since he cannot take away his own life, neither can he give another power to take it, nor let alone let anyone think. This lays a perpetual foundation for disorder, for this operates not till the inconveniency is so great that the majority feel it and find a necessity to have it mended. Now you see the importance of Locke establishing early on that a person rightfully can't take his own life. So he's using it here. He cannot take away his own life, and so he cannot give it to any other power to take it. This is really, really fundamental. If Locke can't maintain the point that a man doesn't have a right to take his own life, a lot of his argument falls down. And then in the second half of that statement, he's reassuring, and he does this as we move towards the end of the book. He goes back and forth between real revolutionary, kind of radical sounding proclamations and reassurances that these things won't happen unless things get really, really, really bad and intolerable, and the people are more or less forced to revolt. So it won't lay a perpetual foundation for disorder, because people will wait until the inconvenience is so great that the majority feel it and find a necessity to have it mended. They want to fix it. Now that's the clue to what he means by appeal to heaven. In every single case, when he uses that term, he is talking about resorting to revolution. I kind of liken this to the way in medieval times people just settled their disputes by duels and jousting. And when they went toe-to-toe with each other, whoever won was considered to, God had decided. Okay, whoever won was considered to be the just one, the one who had truth on his side, because in that battle, God had basically acted. I think that's basically the notion we see here. He goes back into paternal, political, and then adds despotical power to make these distinctions and extend them. So as you'll recall, paternal and parental power is power over children, and it's only legitimate if that power is used for the time that the children are in their minority and need help, and only to the extent that it helps them. But after that, they're free, and in any case, it is not an absolute power. Political power is what he's talking about when he discusses the social contract. It's what each individual agrees to give to society to choose a leader, either expressly or tacitly, meaning the latter meaning that if people have lived under a government for a while and have done so peaceably, then they can be presumed to consent tacitly without even having to say it or do any action to confirm it. Then he moves on to despotical power. He says despotical power is always illegitimate because it's never natural, and no one would ever agree to it. Again, because no one would agree to give up his own life, and that's what you're doing when you put your life into the hands of a despot. It's different from both parental power and political power, and it is the one that is illegitimate. So see, he's separated paternal power from despotical or tyrannical power. And so no one can really come back at Locke and say, well, you're just arguing against monarchy. He's not arguing against monarchy. Monarchy is a legitimate choice of government, but it can go bad, and it goes bad when the monarch becomes a despot. He then goes on to say despotic power equals slavery, which equals a state of war, and we already know that, right? He has said that earlier. When a power is strong enough to basically force you to do its will without your consent, you are both a slave, and a slave is always in a state of war with his master. And that state of war only ends if there is a compact, a social contract, in other words. Then there's some interesting stuff in the chapter entitled Of Conquest. He deals with unjust conquest right away. An unjust conqueror shouldn't have any sort of rightful title over anything. So he spends most of his chapter on what a just conqueror should get. In a just war, which would be a war typically of for defensive purposes, to push back an invader or to punish an aggressor or something like that. In a just war, what power does the conqueror get? Well, it turns out very little, really. He says, first of all, the just conqueror, gets no power over those who have helped him conquer. So, for instance, a faction within the territory that cooperated with him, he would not be able to rightly force his power upon them. They would be more like allies and people for him to treat as citizens. But then he goes on to say, the just conqueror gets no power over the people that he's conquered unless they abetted his enemy. So perhaps that means that he has the right to conquer and subdue the military forces that were arrayed against him and anyone else who helped them, but he wouldn't have at that time seen the people as abetting the army and helping them in the way that in the 20th century and onward we may see that and think that it's legitimate to target and conquer civilians. So this includes a lot of people that are off limits to the conquering power. He also says that the just conqueror gets no power over the people's possessions, including the property of the belligerents, since their children are innocent. So even the property of soldiers who have surrendered to you, you have no ultimate power or right to their property. Now, there's a little bit of fuzziness here because in other points he says that you do have a right to the property of the belligerents or combatants, but then he comes right back and says, but you don't have the right to the property of their wives and children. And of course, their wives and children have their share. So exactly how you would ever sort that out isn't clear. But Locke, one thing I can say is Locke is at great pains to show that people maintain their property rights in this instance, even if they're conquered justly. Further, he has no right to institute a government over these people without their consent. If he does it without their consent, then he will stay in that state of war with them, and he is not a legitimate leader. So you can see this is very limiting, and most kings conquering territory would not be happy with this list. Probably the biggest message that comes out of this chapter is that Locke is deadly serious about property rights. He says, let the conqueror have as much justice on his side as could be supposed. He has no right to seize more than the vanquished could forfeit. His life is as at the victor's mercy, and his service and goods he may appropriate to make himself reparation. But he cannot take the goods of his wife and children. They too had a title to the goods he enjoyed, and their shares in the state he possessed. Again, how do you untangle that? What part do you take? It seems to me that Locke is saying that you can take the man's body for fighting against you, But as far as his estate goes, that remains his wife's and children's. And then he makes another astonishing statement when he points out over the course of the next couple of pages that people who have been conquered, justly or not, have a right to revolt against a despotic ruler, and not just then, because sometimes they don't have the resources, personal and property-wise, to be able to do that, but even many generations later, if they later on have the ability to do it. So they can remember the wrong that was done to them and the property and the lives that were taken from them, justly or not, and decide at a certain point, if they're not satisfied with the way they're being treated, to revolt against this government generations later. Locke will have to reassure readers that this philosophy isn't going to be overly destabilizing by encouraging revolution, and he's at great pains to do that later on. In Of Tyranny, he says, yes, monarchies can become tyrannies, but so can many other governments. Tyranny, he identifies as wherever the power that is put into any hands for the government of the people and the preservation of their properties is applied to other ends and made use of to impoverish, harass, or subdue them to the arbitrary and irregular commands of those that have it. So basically, whenever the power of government is used not for the good and welfare of the people, but for the good and welfare, improperly understood, of the rulers. So the reference to impoverishing subjects, harassing citizens, and subduing them. And of course, this was a chief complaint of the American revolutionaries against King George, that he wasn't using his power to benefit them, but to rather kind of harass and abuse them with taxes and with quartering of his troops and so on. And in that same chapter he asks, so may the commands of a prince be opposed, even if the king is considered sacred, anointed by God? By the way, this sacred character of kings was so believed in and taken so seriously that in the case of King Charles I of England and King Louis XVI, both, you get this weird situation where they're deposed and they're confined, and the people who have revolted against them temporize, going back and forth, deciding what are they actually going to do, treating them sometimes with decorum and respect, and other times with quite a bit of barbarity, because this notion of the integrity and sacredness of the position of the king, the seat of the king, the source of his power being, God himself, there was a real almost superstitious dread of the king. But Locke says the short answer to the question, it's not short in the chapter, believe me, but the short answer is yes. The king's commands can be opposed, and the king can be deposed, and as we will soon see, also, if necessary, killed, because if he violates the public trust and does not take care of the interests of the people, then he is no legitimate king. In fact, he unkings himself, and he becomes a despot, and he's in a war with the people, and so his sacred character, of course, does not exist then. Now, if all this sounds like it should be scaring the daylights out of everybody who values peace and order, and as though Locke was a radical thinker of his day, which he was, along with many others, however, what's to be said? How can Locke more or less convince people that he's not so radical that he's going to stir up rebellion when it isn't necessary and where it could really hurt people. And he does spend time trying to convince his readers that what he's doing is not trying to foment immediate rebellion for small causes. He says people are very reluctant to revolt and will only do so. Again, he's already said this, but he repeats it over and over again. They'll only revolt if their backs are up against a wall and there is no other choice. And basically, that's part of the warning Locke wants to give, that legislators and executives need to really think about what they're doing so that they don't put the people into that position and basically beg to be revolted against. So I'll leave you with this quote. It's a very famous quote that Thomas Jefferson slightly changed the beginning of it anyway and put it into our Declaration of Independence. Locke says, if a long train of actions show the counsels all tending that way, how can a man any more hinder himself from being persuaded in his own mind which way things are going, or for casting about how to save himself, than he could from believing the captain of the ship he was in was carrying him and the rest of the company to Algiers, when he found him always steering that course, though crosswinds, leaks in his ship, and want of men and provisions did often force him to turn his course another way for some time, which he steadily returned to again as soon as the wind, weather, and other circumstances would let him? So what he's getting at here is that, first of all, it takes a long train of actions, or as Jefferson said, a long train of abuses, for people to, wake up and have to pay attention and to get angry enough to actually take action. And they're going to do that by basically noticing that they're being lied to, and that they do need to notice that the ship is being steered towards Algiers, right? It's going in the direction of tyranny. This is also a quote that is designed to reassure to a certain extent, because it's aimed at people thinking about this long before civil society breaks down. What Locke really wants, and what he's going to be getting to in the next and hopefully the final one, because I know you probably want to move on to something else, is that the legislature in a government, the legislative power, ought to right the ship, ought to turn it around, ought to take its power back before things get so bad that it ceases to exist and we have a free-for-all and a true revolution. All right, so anyway, I will be back next week and we'll finish up Locke, maybe do a little bit of, talking about some of the observations after dealing with the book as a whole. So, see you then.